Hello and welcome to Guild Wars 2 Daily. Today we're going to be talking about lore, and the footage in the background comes from a channel called Blah 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 Gaming, who have got a few Guild Wars 2 videos on there, and the one in particular that I've chosen is them in the Shiver Peaks, in fact, because there was a lot of content in the Shiver Peaks available in the beta, but out of all the videos I've seen, really, that's what was lacking most, I thought. So this is quite cool. There's some stuff about the Sons of Sparnir, link in the description if you want to see more of that stuff. But yeah, we're talking about lore. I've got 3 questions. In fact, there weren't many lore questions in recent videos that were going on. It might just be because we're getting a lot less comments recently. But yeah, maybe we've just kind of covered all the good topics at this point. I'm thinking, and this is something I've always wanted to avoid, but I'm thinking maybe in future dailies we could like do specific spotlights, if you will, on various factions or races and stuff like that, as we've been doing already. I've tried to avoid doing that before, but hey, maybe if you guys like that idea, let me know, and then maybe we can kind of swap over to that format a little bit instead of questions and answers and see how things go. But anyway, the first question that I found was asked by Zlashies, who said, what about the Kodan? I don't know if that's their name, but it's the polar bear people. I hear there might be an expansion where they are the new race. Might be BS, but I'd like to know more about them. I didn't play Guild Wars 1. Well, it's funny you say you didn't play Guild Wars 1 and then sort of ask me, because the Kodan didn't exist in Guild Wars 1 at all. This is one of those new races we're all going to be meeting for the first time when we get into Tyria for Guild Wars 2, and they just were not anything about them at all in Guild Wars 1 whatsoever. What we do know of them came initially from trailers, and then it came from a blog post and a couple of interviews just before that came out, in fact, that described them as a race, and it goes into quite a lot of detail. Now, there's no point me just reading out that blog post verbatim to you guys. I've actually already done that in the Dungeon series, but I can sum up essentially how we were introduced to the Kodan and what they're about. So the first we really saw them, I believe it's the first trailer, in fact. You can see the stuff in the Shiver Peaks. There's kind of, I always look back at that first trailer and there's one shot in it where you can see the Shiver Peaks and there's just some trees there, and it's sandwiched between all these other incredible shots of Tyria and these amazing landscapes and stuff, and then there's just that one of the mountains, and it's not very inspiring at all, and that always stands out for me. That was the one bit of the trailer I never thought looked amazing when it first came out. But then after that, sometime shortly after that, you get to actually have a bit of a fly through of one of the Norn areas, and we didn't know specifically where that was in the Norn areas at the time, but you could see walking among the Norn these giant polar bears. At the time, I thought, and a lot of us, I think, thought that this was just like an alternate form you could become as a Norn. You'd have a choice. If you used bear form, you could become the werebear, or you could now become this awesome polar bear as well. And it was this awesome thing, and we all thought, well, I thought at the very least it was going to be about cosmetically altering what your forms look like and all this kind of cool stuff. And I really wanted to play as a Norn that could turn into a polar bear. Later we found out that they were a race in themselves. The way they were developed and essentially became a thing in Guild Wars was, as you might know, they've got a really good art team working at ArenaNet, and they'd done all this concept art, and very free. It sounds like they weren't told specific things to do concept art on, or general ideas. They could just kind of go nuts. One of their artists did this awesome picture of essentially an iceberg that's got loads of sails attached to it, and it was being sailed around by some people, and it was just this bit of concept art that showed essentially like a town existing on an iceberg. And later on, ArenaNet and the developers looked at it, and the guys like Jeff Grubb and Rhys Soseby looked at this image and thought to themselves, right, well, we've got this cool idea, we've also kind of got this concept of these armoured polar bear people, how about we put them together? That's kind of essentially what happened. A lot of people look at the Kodan and think, oh, they're just a rip-off, and because you do see this in some other fantasy things, but at the end of the day, I think they're cool, and ArenaNet shouldn't feel like they can't put cool stuff into the game just because everyone's going to say, oh, they ripped it off from somewhere else. So yeah, really, the Kodan were born, and the lore itself was established for them. They are a group of people that came from the far north. Now, in Guild Wars 1, there was an overlook you could go to in the far Shiver Peaks, one of the most northerly places you could get to in the entire game, and up there you could look out across these really, really far Shiver Peaks, miles and miles and miles away, and kind of guess at what might be out there. And it turns out the Kodan are the only thing we do know was from out there. They kind of have these legends that a long, long time ago, there was a great blizzard far out in the north, and some Kodan decided to head south to like escape this blizzard, while the rest just kind of endured the storm. And the Kodan now believe that those guys that left really fell from grace eventually and became the Norn, and that's kind of their view of them. The Kodan think that the Norn are essentially lesser or fallen Kodan, which is very interesting. There's a lot of theories that can go on around that. But more recently, a lot more Kodan have begun to come south too because of another storm, and you might be able to guess what that storm is. It's Jormag. This elder ice dragon has essentially forced, and you've seen how much he's changed the landscape up there. What was once mountain is now like a giant inland sea. It's incredible. And he's essentially forced this race to come south, and they've sailed down these new seas that have been created into the Shiver Peaks where the Norn now are, and they've kind of got a bit of an alliance going on there. And as a result, you can see the Kodan, and we hear a lot about their sanctuaries and how their leaders in the sanctuaries are protected, and it certainly seems very much like that could be a dungeon at some point in the game. A lot of this speculation I've already kind of covered before on another video, so I won't go too in depth, or I could be going on for ages and ages and ages. But in general, this is a race that potentially is quite a strong candidate for becoming another playable race in a future expansion. However, I would caution you before saying, oh, you get to play as a polar bear person eventually, in the Kodan could very easily become an evil race in my eyes. They could be very easily written to be like that, because the Kodan believe that they are essentially judges of all, and if they feel that something is upsetting the balance of Tyria, then they think it's totally okay for them to go in and try and fix whatever it is that's throwing things out of balance. And if at some point they deem that the humans are causing some kind of unbalance, like maybe they are holding on and they should be extinct or something, then they could essentially end up being against us as playable characters. So it could go either way. I wouldn't be surprised if they became a playable race eventually. Not in the first expansion though, and we'll kind of just have to see what goes on. As I say, if I start doing spotlights and stuff, maybe we'll have a closer look at the Kodan. But that's who they are. They're the polar bear people, and really we're all going to be meeting them for the first time when we get into Guild Wars 2, because they simply weren't there in Guild Wars 1. Lamp of Hell asked, were we ever told where the central transfer chamber and subsequently Primordus existed in Tyria? The Asura emerged in the Tarnished Coast. Is it possible Primordus lives beneath the Maguma jungle, which is the reason it's now called the Waste? A lot of people are speculating about this. We know that the Maguma jungle was, in Guild Wars 1, an actual jungle. It had some wastelands near it, but it was mostly luscious and tropical, and it was an actual jungle. And we know that in Guild Wars 2, the 250 years have not been kind to that region of the world, and it is now known as the Maguma Waste, and pretty much everything there has dried up and died. The reason why it has become the Waste has been answered in interviews as simply being a side effect of the movements of the Elder Dragons, or is related somehow to the Elder Dragons. And we've also noticed that a lot of Primordus' stuff seems to happen more in the southwestish areas, or the more western areas. So a lot of people are kind of trying to pin that on Primordus. In fact, I saw a map on Reddit recently where somebody had highlighted general areas of the map where each Elder Dragon seemed to have dominion over, and a lot of people are kind of pinning these wastes over as Primordus' area. I don't think that it's really as simple as that. The central transfer chamber, to your question itself, was nowhere near the Tarnished Coast. Absolutely nowhere near there, and nowhere near the Maguma jungle either. It was above a place called Yak's Bend, which was essentially the first outpost you found in the Shiver Peaks in Guild Wars 1. So it is really, really far away from that location, and that's where we know he woke up. The thing with the Asura is, don't forget that they could travel very quickly underground. They developed these Asura gates to get them from cavern to cavern to cavern underground, and they were teleporting all over the place. So even though their central transfer chamber, where arguably a lot of Asura would go and a lot of Asuran interaction, I suppose, took place, even though that was based there in the Shiver Peaks, they could easily have then got an Asura gate where the majority of them, maybe two of their large cities that were under the ground, were somewhere near the Tarnished Coast, and that's why they popped up there. Or as I discussed before, maybe they had some kind of interaction with another older race, the race responsible for the ruins on the Tarnished Coast in the first place. that may have been the reason why they went up there rather than out in the Shiver Peaks. In any case, Primordus woke up there in the Shiver Peaks, and I don't like the idea of him only hanging around near the waist. I like the idea more that he also is moving very fast underneath all of Tyria, that no matter where you're standing on Tyria, you could be standing in the Brand, you could be standing in the heart of Ore, corrupted, with the Zaitan flying above you, and even still, there is that risk that deep down below your feet, Primordus could be also watching, and his own minions could be there. I like that idea, and I like the idea that maybe as we're playing through the game, that kind of fear comes through, and eventually when we get to tackle him head on, we have really a very awesome experience where we can go underground a lot of what we've been walking around the surface on before that expansion came out. I think that would be really cool. So I'd rather he not just be relegated to the waste, and I'd also like if there was a more convincing story as to why the waste became the way they are, rather than simply, oh, one of the Elder Dragons is hanging out near there. They could go with a lot of stuff to explain what happened there, and I'd like that. I really would. The last question is from SOL07 at 07, who said, so are the Naga and the Crate different tribes in a similar vein to Tengu and Centaurs, or are they completely different races, as the lore seems to indicate, at least in comparison to the Forgotten? These are the 3 Serpentine races in Tyria, and a lot of us try and, like, pin them together and explain how maybe one of these races evolved into the next and then the next became the next. Really, you should just get it in your head though that these are completely different races. The Forgotten were brought to the planet by the gods, so it's really not fair to say that they have evolved from the Crate, say, or from the Naga, because there just hasn't simply been enough time for that. The Naga and the Crate themselves might have some kind of a relation. We do see that a lot of the Naga love the water. That's a big thing about the Naga. The reason why they're so angry with you in factions is because where their main home once was, the Jade Sea, has now turned to Jade, of course. Well, I wonder if it was always called the Jade. It can't have always been called the Jade Sea, can it? So I wonder what it was called before the Jade Wind struck. Anyway, the Naga used to live there, and all their homes essentially froze up, so they kind of had to leave. But they do still exist underwater to an extent, so they are kind of similar to the Crate in that way, except Crate we know really came from deep oceans. Really, Crate you wouldn't find around much land before these Elder Dragons started doing stuff. They were a long way out, and a lot of the time in the beta you'll find people and you'll talk to like Quaggan and stuff, or Hylook, and they'll say, oh yeah, we were happy here, but now the Crate have come in because they've been forced here from an Elder Dragon. They used to live way out in the oceans, and that wasn't something we really heard about the Naga before. They could be related somehow, but we haven't had any lore. They're not different tribes of one another. They are very distinct, very separate races, and you should remember that. And in fact, if you just take a little while to look at their models, you can see they are very, very different looking, I suppose. It's a bit harder with the Crate because they come in many different forms, and a couple of those forms can look a little bit similar to the Naga or the Forgotten, but as soon as you pay any attention to the little details, you'll see that there's a difference. Like the Forgotten, for example, have more than 2 arms, which is a pretty big thing. I'm looking for a lot more lore, hopefully, that will come out on the Naga. They're one of my favourite races, and that might be just because we don't know much about them right now, but they were always quite a cool race in Guild Wars 1, and they're not there for the launch of Guild Wars 2, it looks like, so very curious to see what's happening with them down in Cantha. And the Crate, you know, are just evil straight up, so there's some depth there to them. We know quite a bit about how they live, but I'm not that fascinated by exactly where they came from. I just want to kill them at this point. But yeah, so let me know, guys, for future episodes if you'd rather just specific spotlights on certain topics, and if you are up for that, what those topics might be, I guess. And yeah, thanks very much for watching, and I suppose I'll see you tomorrow. See you next time, everyone.